Hello, everyone. We're going to start in about 1 more minute. There's still a lot of people joining. Okay, we're going to get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining. There will be quite a few of you on this call today, so we really appreciate your attention to this. My name is Charlie Young, and I'm with Ohio State University. And today we're going to talk about all about CMMC for suppliers of General Dynamics land systems. Today's webinar is in combination of a number of different areas and companies involved. First of all, from Ohio State University, we're with the College of Engineering. I'll give you a little bit more background of what we do here in a minute or so. Also on the line is Sawdey Solution Services, who will be giving the crux of the presentation today. And this is in combination working with the Department of Defense and now the OLDCC, which stands for the Office of Local Defense Community Cooperation, as part of the Department of Defense, and of course General Dynamics Land Systems, since this is for the suppliers of that company. Next slide. The key things that we want to cover today for the suppliers here are these key topics of discussions. And I guess before I should do that, I should also mention that everything that we do today will be recorded. Also, the slides will be made available. Both of these should be available tomorrow or Thursday, as soon as we can get through everything. So please note that you will be able to get all of the recording and the slides will be available. We will be able to have a Q&A session at the end. We hope to have enough time to have a pretty lengthy version of that. So if you have questions, please put it in the Q&A session. There are a lot of people on, so we won't be able to take them one at a time. I mean, verbally, but we will be able to read them and answer them. Also, if you are having any technical issues, please put that in the chat session. So if you're having trouble with audio or video or anything like that, we'll try to help you with it if you would put that in chat. Okay, so again, we're recording it and the slides will be available tomorrow or Thursday. So the key things that we're going to be covering today are just an introduction of CMMC, what the roadmap is for the CMMC, what would it take to gain the compliance in that area. And also there's a lot of recent updates, so we want to make sure we explain all of the recently announced DFARS requirements that are there. So those are the objectives of what we want to try to cover in today's discussion. Next slide, please. So the agenda will be very straightforward. I will be giving this quick welcome and introduction to DCAP, which is Defense Cybersecurity Assurance Program. Then General Dynamics, Bill Rapp will give us an introduction and give the importance of this program to all of you. Then Sawdey Solution Services will be talking to us about all of the key topics in CMMC. And we'll close with a Q&A session, and we'll try to leave plenty of time for that. Our goal is to be done with the presentation in approximately 1 hour and 15 minutes, leaving 45 minutes or so for questions and answers as we go through all of this. So we want to make sure that we have plenty of time to get everything there. And I would also say that if we don't get to all the questions, if you put them, again, if you put them in the Q&A side of it, we will try to answer what we don't get to in writing, and then also get that out at the same time we send out the slides. Okay, next slide. So you might ask, why is Ohio State in the middle of this? And so there's a little bit of a story here. First of all, I work for Ohio State. I'm part of the Center for Design and Manufacturing Excellence at Ohio State, and we're part of the College of Engineering. We have two key things that we really try to focus on. One is product development for anything that has to do with advanced manufacturing. And the second side of it is we want to make sure that students gain valuable experience working on any type of project that we would do for advanced manufacturing as we go forward. So we have a team of engineers, and we work directly with faculty for many different types of advanced manufacturing. We have a large facility of about 30,000 square feet. It's ITAR compliant. We do anything from machining to injection molding to die casting to additive manufacturing, robotics, vision systems, automation and control, software, electronics, both at the board level and at a system level. So and a lot of different types of approaches in biomedical and some things like that. We've probably done about 450 projects in the last 5 years, all direct with industry or the government. And aerospace and defense takes up about 70 to 80% of what we do. And it just so happens that one of the other things that we're involved with is cybersecurity, especially in manufacturing. So we worked with the Department of Defense to also work with the University of Michigan and Purdue to be part of the Defense Cybersecurity Assurance Program. Next slide, please. And that's what this slide is all about. So as part of that, we are trying to do what we can do to help small businesses with a lot of the cybersecurity challenges that are out there, and especially now with a lot of new regulations that are going on. We made this approach with General Dynamics Land Systems to work directly with all of you as their suppliers, because it's very important to them as well as it is to the Department of Defense that this cybersecurity is taken care of, and that everybody is following a lot of these new guidelines that are part of CMMC and DFARS. Okay, next slide, please. Today, we will be, the main speakers that will be involved is, first of all, Bill Rapp from General Dynamics Land Systems will give an introduction and talk about the importance of this for General Dynamics. And then the next three people that you see here are all from Sawdey Solution Services, which they will give an introduction of that company, but recognize they're located in the Dayton area. And they do almost all of their business with the Department of Defense and government contracts. So they are very, very familiar with supply chain and cybersecurity as it relates to small businesses and being suppliers to the military. General Dynamics has an enormous presence in Michigan and Ohio. So it makes sense that as such, they are a very key supplier for this area, although we have the suppliers who are invited are located anywhere around the country and in some cases outside of the country. So we welcome all of you here to see to learn more about CMMC and then have a discussion on what we're talking about. Okay, next slide. Also wanted you to have this slide in here so that you knew how to reach us if you have any questions or concerns afterwards, or just want to talk about some of the things you heard today or didn't hear today. So you have our names and email addresses here. We don't have the folks from General Dynamics on this slide because we are assuming that you already have your contacts there that you work with on a day-to-day basis. But feel free to reach out to any of us if there's anything technical, or you just want to know what's going on in the business, or you want to see how others are working on some of this. We're happy to have that discussion with you. If you want to reach out to any one of us here, you have that. And you may have a question after we go through the Q&A that just comes up, so please feel free to call us then. Next slide, please. Okay, so with that, I'll hand it off to the next part of our presentation here today. Bill Rapp from General Dynamics Land Systems will talk to us about the effect of this on his company. Thank you all. I'll be back with you in a bit.
Thank you, Charlie. Just a sound check. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Good, good. All right. Next chart, please. So again, thanks for the opportunity to speak here at this forum. Very important topic. We're talking about cybersecurity here. A little bit about me. Again, my name is Bill Rapp. I'm a department manager in procurement, supply chain management at General Dynamics. I've been with the company for a little over 20 years and in charge of metallic purchasing, which, as you may assume, our vehicles are made mostly out of metal. So about 60 to 70% of the discrete buy items come through my department. So I have a vested interest in making sure that we are compliant with cybersecurity. And talk about compliance. And over the past 20 years, I've seen the landscape of the defense business in terms of compliance change dramatically, especially over the last about 5 to 10 years. Compliance has become much more rigorous within the defense, and the government is in our business far more than they ever have been in the past. And cybersecurity is just another phase of that, and it's not anything new. Cybersecurity has been around for a while. Can you go to the next chart, please? In fact, cybersecurity has been around since the 70s, and it's been a concern of the U.S. government. And about 3 years ago, it became a very big concern and started being discussed from the DoD to the prime contractors, for which General Dynamics, of course, is a prime contractor. And at that time, General Dynamics started reaching out to its supply base, and we started sending out a lot of mailers and questionnaires, trying to assess where we were in terms of our overall compliance. And when I say overall compliance, they're not just General Dynamics compliance with our customer via the prime contract, but also with our supply base, because you are an integral part of that overall compliance fabric for our industry. And we started gathering a whole bunch of information about readiness, and some of the responses we got were probably a little less than accurate in terms of where we were in the overall assessment of CMMC and the readiness of CMMC. And so over the last about 6 months, General Dynamics has amped up their activities with its supply base. A lot of SurveyMonkey surveys have gone out. I'm sure a lot of you have been contacted by buyers. Each one of the procurement managers has a team that is actively working with supply base to ensure that we're working towards all the necessary steps of cybersecurity. First one and the compliance for the 2 DFAR clauses that have just been put into play is your SPRS self-assessment in the system. And so this is real, folks. The government has been talking about this now for many years. And now, as of November of last year, November 30 of last year, I believe, 2 new DFAR clauses covering cybersecurity were put into official regulation. And there's a lot more smarter people that are going to talk about those DFAR clauses and what they mean. But what it means to me as a prime contractor and your customer is that these DFAR clauses now are being put into our contracts that we've received subsequent to November 30. In fact, we have dozens of contracts now that have them. And we just received a $4.6 billion 5-year Abrams IDIQ contract. These 2 DFAR clauses are not in there. However, the customer's view and our legal view is that the Christian doctrine, which states that if there is a law in practice and a business assumption that that law is applicable, it is applicable de facto if it is not in your contract. And so our ABLES contract is considered to have these DFAR clauses in it. So what does that mean? Well, first step for that compliance is everybody has to re-register in the SPRS system, do your self-assessment. If you don't do that, technically, I cannot place a purchase order with you for a contract that I have with the U.S. government that has these DFAR clauses. I'm taking that, and all of General Dynamics Land Systems is taking that a little step further, all right? Because I want to get ahead. We all want to get ahead of this. Do not want to have a situation in which the government starts dictating to us whom we can do business with and whom we cannot. So I'm taking it a step further. Not only do you have to have SPRS self-assessment registration with the customer, you also have to be working towards your SSP, your POEM, and you also have to be actively engaged, either have hired somebody or contracted a consultant to work towards CMMC level 1 or level 3 certification. If you're not doing that, then we have a problem, because at some point, and at some point it's going to come faster than we realize, the customer is going to dictate to us via prime contract what supplier level certification we are allowed to engage in for their contracts. And at that point, it won't be a question of can we, it will be you cannot. So we have a time right now where we can actively work this, right? And that's why we're having this webinar, so you understand holistically what cybersecurity is about. What does it mean? What do you have to do? What is your part? And whom you can seek out for assistance in order to get cyber secure. So if you look at that last underlined statement there, it is a must-have. Don't get phased out. That is what my message is from your customer to you. Don't get phased out, folks. If you don't take action, if you haven't already started taking action, or if you don't follow through this action, you will get phased out. So if you've done your SPRS, don't think you're done. You're not. You still have got to be actively working towards a CMMC level 1, level 3 certification. If you don't, you are in risk of being phased out. The last bullet there says cybersecurity compliance is required for suppliers to do business with General Dynamics and USD DoD. This isn't just DoD, this is all of the DoD prime contractors that are going to force this. If you're not hearing it from the other prime contractors, you will soon. So the message that I want you to leave or take away from me, again, as the guy that's got his finger on the sourcing selections and contract award for 60 to 70% of the discrete buy items that are bought by General Dynamics Land Systems, is if you are an existing supplier with us, get your SPRS self-assessment registered with the government. Get going on an SSP and a POEM. Have somebody hired or working with a contractor to work towards your CMMC level 1 or level 3 certification. If you are a prospective supplier to General Dynamics, that is, you're not currently doing business with us right now, but you wish to, you must do all those things before you try to do business with us. It used to be when a prospective supplier would call me, the first thing I would ask, okay, what are your capabilities? What do you have that new that brings to the table that is going to help me execute my contracts? Now the first question I ask is, are you cyber secure? And if you're not, my response is, call me when you are. Not, let's see how you do, let's give you some quote. No, call me when you are. So 2 messages here. Existing suppliers, get going on this. My expectation with you is that you are CMMC ready this year. New suppliers, if you're not there yet, if you're not actively engaged in it, don't try to become a supplier with General Dynamics Land Systems, because you will not be onboarded until such time as you are. We are actively going through our supply base right now, our current supply base, and categorizing our suppliers as must-have suppliers, nice-to-have suppliers, and suppliers that we can live without. And I'm here to tell you that if you are not actively doing what you're supposed to be doing, and you're a supplier who can do without, you are actively, right now, today, being rationalized out of my supply base. And if you are a supplier that's nice to have, if you are not actively working it, we will start working to resource your components on these long-term IDIQ contracts that we're being awarded. And any engineer that's coming to me and says, hey, I want to do business with this new supplier on a developmental program, my first question to that engineer is that supplier cyber secure? And if the answer is no, I'm rejecting the request. That's how important this is, folks. We have to become cyber secure. All you have to do is turn on the television and see everywhere around the world, from celebrities' iCloud's account being hacked and put out on the internet to the U.S. government's systems. Most of the U.S. government systems have been hacked by China and Russia. And there isn't a month that goes by that a supplier doesn't call me up and says, hey, we had a breach. Somebody hacked into our email address and sending out erroneous emails with documents in there and said, here's a document you wanted, and that document contains a virus. Just earlier this month, I had a casting supplier come to me and said, I have a ransomware. I had to take my system offline for almost 3 weeks. That's 3 weeks that a supplier couldn't do business. And that hurt me, put me behind on my schedule. Now I'm in a shortage situation. This is serious, it's real, it's now, and you must comply, or again, you will be phased out. So not a threat, but a promise from the U.S. government via these FAR clauses, DFAR clauses in our prime contracts. We must comply to this. Thank you for hearing me. I appreciate the opportunity to speak. Charlie, it's to you now.
Thank you very much, Bill. I'll turn this over to Harry at this point to talk about the whole introduction and overview of CMMC.
Thank you, Charlie. Thanks for the introduction to what you all do at CDME. And Bill, thank you very much for that introduction and really setting the stage for the seriousness and the importance of this topic, DoD Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, or CMMC. So again, my name is Harry Krukenberg. I am with Sawdey Solution Services. We are a recently graduated small business in all NAICS categories except for research and development. We're still considered small in R&D. But we started out as a small business in Beaver Creek, Ohio, serving primarily the Air Force at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base 20 years ago. We'll celebrate our 20th anniversary in the spring. And since that time, we've grown into a 400+ employee company, doing just short of $100 million a year. And we provide a variety of professional services to primarily government customers and clients. We serve all services within the DoD. We serve the Department of Homeland Security. We serve the U.S. Coast Guard and several other agencies within the federal government. And one of our core focus areas is cybersecurity. And we did that exclusively for government contractors until recently. And when the government started talking about CMMC as a certification, we saw it as an opportunity to help companies much like ours, and much like the company that we've been over the past 20 years, in becoming more cyber secure and cyber compliant. Because we realized that the core business of many firms that are serving the government, either as a prime contractor or a subcontractor or a professional services contractor, is not cybersecurity. It's IT, it's manufacturing, it's software development, providing commercial off-the-shelf items. So, we're looking at this as an opportunity to help the government achieve its cybersecurity goals through assistance to government contractors. So, my background is actually not cybersecurity. I'm a supply chain professional, but we see such a great impact of this and potential impact of this certification program on the DoD supply chain that we've combined our expertise in supply chain with our expertise internally in cybersecurity to form a team of professionals to help other customers through this journey. So with us today, I also have James Pym, who is one of our CMMC delivery program managers, and Mike Smith, who is one of our cybersecurity subject matter experts. Mike will be monitoring the Q&A, so submit your questions via the Q&A, and we'll try and handle those throughout the presentation, but definitely at the end. As Charlie mentioned, we'll have plenty of time at the end. And James and I will split up the presentation itself and go through the slides. So excited to be here today and look forward to talking with you all. Next slide. So here's our agenda. We'll talk about specific cybersecurity threats just to make sure that we level set what we're talking about as to what exactly we're trying to protect against. And there are a variety of threats out there that can really create havoc in our organizations and in our systems. Then we'll talk about what needs to be protected. And where CMMC is concerned, we're talking about primarily CUI, or Controlled Unclassified Information, often called Cui for short. Next, we'll walk through the various cybersecurity related frameworks that brought us to the CMMC model that we have today. And then we'll spend some time digging into cybersecurity maturity model certification itself, what the model looks like, what it contains, what the various capability domains are that we need to be concerned with. And then we'll talk about the implementation timeline and the planned rollout that has been publicized by the government. And then finally, we'll talk about getting to compliance. What can you do as alternatives to become compliant? And we'll also share with you some resources to help you become compliant. And then at the end, as I mentioned, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. Next slide. So what are some of the threats that we need to be concerned about, especially as a small business? Next slide. Almost 2/3 of all cyber attacks are now directed at small businesses. Bill mentioned how critical cybersecurity is to the overall supply chain. And when you consider the amount of product, service, and delivery that comes from small businesses within supply chain, it's easy to see that small business systems and computing domains need to be protected from a cybersecurity standpoint just as much, if not more so, than those of our large prime contractors. Small businesses are often the ways attackers reach larger targets, larger businesses and the government themselves. And that's often because small businesses make easier targets, as they're often less prepared for cyber attack. And that's really what this is all about, is making sure that all businesses, large and small, are better prepared, better protected, and have multiple layers of protection in place. Next slide. So what are some of the threats that we should be thinking about and that we've seen in the past? First of all, let's talk about the different types of actors. These can be nation states, and most of these are well known in the news, been talked about, Russia and China primarily, but there are cyber attacks going on across the globe from country to country, public and private systems almost constantly. So these attacks can come from any nation state. They could also be from private lone actors such as hacktivists, hackers with a cause, if you will, or just plain criminals who are trying to get into our systems to steal information and exploit it, resell it, or just create chaos within our systems and within our marketplaces. And those threats can be made to not just our systems and our hardware, but the software that resides on those systems, and ultimately to the people that work on those systems and the services that they provide. So it's important to understand what it is that we're trying to protect. At the heart of CMMC, it's information, but that information can be exploited through a variety of means and techniques. Next slide. So in 2019, 9 cybersecurity threats were identified, and most of these hold today, and if not in this order, in some similar order. Viruses and worms. We've all heard about viruses. We understand what viruses are. We have virus protection on our systems, but there are several other types of attacks which can exploit our systems either covertly, where we don't know that this is occurring, or overtly with things like ransomware, where your files are essentially hijacked and held for ransom until you do something, pay a ransom, or commit some other act that is desired by the attacker to get your data back. So just an example of some of the different types of information exploitation that is going on out there and that we may be faced with. So the question becomes, how confident are you? Next slide. And most of us feel pretty confident. If we use the analogy of Bill Paxton playing Private Hudson in Aliens, pre-attack, an extreme level of confidence. We think we've got it covered, but post-attack, you're exhausted, you're defeated, and it's essentially game over. So what we try to talk to our customers and our clients about is approaching defense of our networks through a concept called defense in depth, which is essentially providing multiple layers of security that not only does one have to be defeated, but many or all of them need to be defeated in order for someone to get to and exploit our information. So, this is the approach that's advocated in the CMMC model, and that the model is built around. And if you do the things that are specified in the model, there's little doubt that you'll be adequately protected. Next slide. So before we get into the specifics of the model itself, let's talk about what it is that we're trying to protect. What is CUI, or Controlled Unclassified Information? First of all, we need to understand that CMMC is data-driven. Next slide. And we'll have a homework assignment for you at the end, but prior to, it's important to give a little history here. Prior to 2010, we had what I call data acronym palooza. We had CUI, we had controlled technical information, we had for authorized use only, or FOUO, we had sensitive information, we had federal contract information, and all of this had different rules and different structures associated with them for protection. And really, while it was all well-intended, what it served to do was confuse a lot of people. So in 2010, an executive order was signed that, and it was updated then in 2017, that basically said, we as a federal government will consider all of this information under the umbrella of controlled unclassified information, and give it rules and a structure so that it's all equally protected. Now, for CMMC, there are different levels. If you've read or become familiar with the model at all, level 1, we're concerned only with federal contract information, or FCI. We'll get to a definition of that in a moment. But anything above level 1, we're focused on controlled unclassified information. And there are multiple categories. And now next we'll give a definition. Next slide. Next slide. So controlled unclassified information is defined as information the government creates or possesses, or that an entity creates or possesses for or on behalf of the government, that a law, regulation, or government-wide policy requires or permits an agency to handle using safeguarding or dissemination controls. And so essentially, it is recognized data that is part of a contract that the government creates or possesses, or an entity that's serving the government creates or possesses. And the good thing is, with respect to CUI, is that it's well defined in terms of what's considered CUI. And the DoD has actually created a CUI registry, and we included a link there in the slide. And last year, in March of 2020, the DoD released an instruction that establishes policy, responsibilities, and procedures for dealing with CUI. Furthermore, they came up with a marking scheme so that there is no doubt when a contractor receives CUI from the government. And they also put in place a requirement for the program office or the requiring activity to identify CUI at the time of contract award. So I guess that's the good news, is that it should be fairly obvious in your contract what the government is talking about when it comes to CUI. What's trickier is whether or not your contract will include CUI ahead of time, because that existence of CUI will determine whether or not you require level 3 certification under CMMI or above, or simply level 1, which is concerned with protecting federal contract information. Can we go back one slide, please? Thank you. So this slide defines federal contract information. An FCI is information provided by or generated for the government under a contract that is not intended for public release. So this is essentially metadata associated with your contract, but it can also include specific technical data. So think of it this way. All information associated with your contract is FCI. CUI is a subset of federal contract information that requires a higher level of protection. Okay? So the bottom line is, if you have a contract with the DoD, you must ensure that the information provided by the government, as well as the information that you produce, is protected. Okay, let's jump ahead 2 slides. So what needs to be protected? When we're talking about CUI, the CUI registry groups information into 20 organizational index groupings, and then each of those has its own specific categories of CUI. One of those organizational index groupings is defense. And then within that, one of the categories is controlled technical information. Now, for most government contracts, when we talk about CUI, we're talking about controlled technical information. Next slide. And that information can come in the form of any of the things listed here on the bottom of the slide. Research and engineering data, engineering drawings, specifications, standards, manuals, even data sets, or the results of studies and analyses. So the bottom line is, if you're making something unique to DoD requirements, you almost certainly have CUI that must be protected. Next slide. So let's talk just a little bit about the cybersecurity related frameworks that led to the creation and adoption of the cybersecurity maturity model certification. Next slide. The first is a cybersecurity framework. This is a NIST framework that provides a policy framework of computer security guidance in the form of standards, guidelines, and practices. It consists of a profile, a core, and then various tiers. And then built off of that is the risk management framework. And this is governed by NIST Special Publication 853, currently on revision 4. And 853 provides a catalog of security and privacy controls for the federal government. Those controls are then categorized into 19 different families designed to promote overall information security. The governance here is pretty substantial, and it follows a specific hierarchy. And within that risk management framework is the policy for protecting CUI, or controlled unclassified information. Next slide. And that is governed by NIST Special Publication 800-171. Now, 800-171 describes 14 families of security requirements for protecting the confidentiality of CUI in information systems, non-federal information systems. So those that are owned, managed, and administered by contractors and the like. And you can see the 14 families are listed there. Now, until recently, the adherence to NIST Special Publication 800-171 was done through self-assessments. So essentially, if the DFARS clause, which was 252-204-7012, if that clause appeared in your contract, essentially, if you accepted the contract, you were self-certifying, saying, we meet the requirements within these 14 families. Next slide. And that required you to have essentially an adequate security system in place. You had to have a system security plan. You had to have a plan of action and milestones in place for anything where you weren't compliant within this SP 800-171. And then you had a duty and a responsibility to rapidly report any cyber incidents that occurred through an incident response plan, and within 72 hours of those incidents occurring. And this had been around for a while. Bill mentioned that this is nothing new, and the DFARS Clause 7012 had been in place since late 2017. But again, compliance with it was very passive. All you had to do was accept the contract with this clause in it, and you were saying, we comply. So that changed very recently with the publication of what's known as the Interim Rule. And we'll get into the specifics of the Interim Rule here next. Next slide. So the Interim Rule was first published at the end of September, and compliance with it became a requirement at the end of November. And it's essentially intended to drive compliance within the defense industrial base prior to full CMMC implementation. So you'll see later on, we'll show a timeline for CMMC rollout, and the government is adopting what is called a crawl, walk, run approach. CMMC will only appear in a handful of contracts this year, several more next year, and then full implementation is expected to take place by 2026. But the government recognizes that there is a sense of urgency and a real problem today with members of the defense industrial base being compliant with cybersecurity regulations. So what they did was put in place this interim rule, which essentially says contractors must evaluate their systems against NIST Special Publication 800-171, and then record the results of that evaluation in SPRS, or the Supplier Performance Risk System. When in doing so, they, as a contractor, they perform a basic assessment, and that basic assessment is pre-award. So once you do that, enter your score in SPRS, you're considered compliant. But then the government also has the option to come back post-award and do a medium or a high confidence level assessment. And those are distinguished essentially by the type of information that needs to be protected in the contract and is done at the discretion of the government. So you really won't know if it's medium or high until the time comes, but there's really not a significant difference in the requirements because it all goes back to the controls within SP 800-171. Next slide. So this interim rule established 3 new regulations in the form of 3 defarce clauses. And we listed these here verbatim for your reference, but they're actually pretty simple. The first one, 7019, essentially says you need to do what I just described, which is perform a self-assessment, enter it into the SPRS system prior to contract award. 7020 says you must make your systems available to a government-run assessment at their request, post-award. It also says that if you're a prime contractor, you must flow down these same requirements to all of your subcontractors. And then 7021 is sort of waiting in the wings. It's the defarce clause that says, at the end of all this, contractor compliance with CMMC is a mandatory requirement. So once CMMC is put into your contract, sometime over the next 4 to 5 years, 7021 comes into play, and 7019 and 7020 go by the wayside. Next slide. So we put this in here just as a visual cue to SPRS. There has been some confusion since the interim rule went into place about how do I access SPRS, where is it, what do I do? This link here will essentially tell you everything that you need to know. It's actually a fairly simple system. You have to actually apply for access to the system, but once you're in, it's pretty straightforward on entering the data and the types of information that you need to enter and upload them. So this is the end of my initial part of the presentation. I'm going to turn it over to James now. And James is going to take us through the CMMC model itself. So James?
Thank you, Harry, and good afternoon, everyone. Over the next few slides, we're going to talk about what is CMMC at its core, how is it structured, and how organizations become certified. Next slide, please. So at its core, CMMC is a unified cybersecurity standard designed to protect information in future DoD acquisitions. And as Harry talked about, CMMC is specifically focused on protecting FCI and CUI. Now that we have a better understanding of what it is, what is the objective of CMMC? To assess and verify the institutionalization and maturity of cybersecurity practices and processes of DoD contractors via third-party assessment. A lot to unpack in this bullet, but the 2 things I want you to focus on are institutionalization and third-party assessment. We're going to talk more about both of these items in the coming slides. Next, CMMC is at the entity level. XYZ organization will be CMMC level 1 or CMMC level 3. There are individual designations and certifications within the CMMC ecosystem, but when we're talking about the CMMC levels, they are going to be at the entity level. The required CMMC level will be driven by what specific RFPs require. Now, I understand that many of you on the line are obviously suppliers to GDLS, so that will obviously likely drive, what level you need to strive for. So what do I mean by this? The DoD is not going to come to your organization and tell you what CMMC level you need to be. It is possible in this case that GDLS obviously will potentially tell you what level you need to be, but obviously if you have other primes you're working with, that could also impact. So ultimately though, it's going to be a business decision each organization needs to make. Once CMMC is fully implemented, and we'll talk a little bit about the expected timeline in the coming slides, all DoD solicitations will have a specified CMMC level that is required. Lastly, it's expected CMMC will be a replacement for NIST 800-171. Obviously, as Harry talked about, there's been a few shortcomings with NIST 800-171 worth highlighting. So one, obviously self-assessment is a bit different than a third-party assessment. And as you can imagine, companies may have been self-assessing that they had or were planning to implement all 110 controls or practices, but in actuality, probably very few organizations had actually implemented all 110 controls. The other shortcoming of NIST 800-171 is it was one size fits all. As we will see in the coming slides, the number of practices varies significantly depending on the CMMC level. 110 controls might be a bit overkill for an organization that doesn't have CUI on their systems. Next slide, please. So the graphic on the left shows the CMMC model is composed of 17 capability domains. Just think of these as 17 buckets of practices with like attributes. And one thing I want to note, CMMC refers to them as practices, but this is the same as what NIST 800-171 referred to as controls. So Harry talked about earlier, in NIST 800-171, there are 14 families, which are the non-highlighted ones you see in the graphic. With CMMC, they call them domains, and there are 17, with the 3 additional being the ones highlighted with the green boxes. Those are asset management, situational awareness, and recovery. In the graphic to the right, you can see how CMMC is organized into 5 levels. In terms of practices or controls, they range from basic cyber hygiene at level 1 to good cyber hygiene at level 3, all the way to advanced progressive at level 5. We're going to focus on levels 1 through 3 since most of the folks listening in are going to be working towards either levels 1 or 3. To the right of the practices in terms of processes, CMMC is organized by performed at level 1, documented at level 2, and managed at level 3. So what do I mean by that? So performed means that you're doing the required practices at level 1. You don't actually have to have any required processes at level 1. As long as you are performing the required practices and can provide the required evidence, you are compliant. This changes drastically with levels 2 and level 3. Documented at level 2 requires 2 processes. 1, that for each of the domain areas, there's a documented policy. And 2, there are documented practices as to how an organization plans to implement those policies. At level 3, there is 1 process, which requires organizations establish, maintain, and resource a plan demonstrating how they plan to manage the required practices. Plans may include information such as missions, goals, project plans, resourcing, required training, and relevant stakeholders. To summarize, at level 1, there are no required processes. Not that we were recommending that you have no processes if you're going for level 1, we aren't. Level 2 is more of a transition level. Organizations will most likely be striving for either level 1 or level 3. If your organization's going for level 3, you not only need to implement the required practices, but they will have to be implemented the 3 processes I mentioned. So we're going to get more into the practices on the next slide. Next slide, please. So this slide shows a breakout of the practices by each level. There are only 17 practices at level 1, and as I mentioned, there's actually no processes. But this increases significantly with an additional 55 practices at level 2, an additional 58 practices at level 3. So if you're going for level 3, you will need to implement 130 practices in addition to the 3 processes we talked about on the last slide. A key item to note, the 130 practices at level 3 contain the 110 controls from NIST 800-171, plus an additional 20 practices that are CMMC specific. So as you can see, the model is cumulative. In order to meet a specific CMMC level, an organization must meet the practices and processes within that level, as well as those below it. Again, we are focusing on levels 1 through 3, but so folks are aware, there are a total of 171 practices when going up to level 5. Next slide, please. So this is just a further depiction of the different domain areas and the different practices. We like to think of CMMC as a 3-legged stool with the 17 domains grouped into buckets of technical, management, and operational. You can see that on the graphic on the left. On the right breaks out the practices by domain and by level. So for example, I know it's a little hard to see, but at level 1, only 6 of the domains apply for the 17 practices. But at level 3, all 17 domains apply for the 130 practices you need to implement. I know I threw a lot of numbers at you. The key ones to remember are at level 1, there's 17 practices, and at level 3, there's 130 practices and 3 processes you need to implement. Next slide, please. So, the big question, how will my company go about achieving a CMMC level certification? So companies will coordinate directly with a certified independent CMMC third-party assessment organization, better known as a C3PAO, to request and schedule a CMMC assessment. Companies can only request an assessment if they have implemented all practices for a requested assessment level. POAMs are not acceptable. So this is clearly a big difference from NIST 800-171. As Harry laid out, as long as you had a system security plan and a POAM and a get well date you were working towards, you were technically compliant. So as you would expect, the C3PAOs are going to come on site to conduct these assessments. A major hurdle of the assessment is that organizations will need to provide the C3PAO 2 types of objective evidence for each practice. The 3 types of objective evidence are interviews, evidence review, and testing. And what I mean by evidence review is they would be reviewing the applicable policy, plans, and artifacts and the like. Once the assessment process is finalized, upon successful demonstration of the appropriate capabilities and organizational maturity, the organization will hopefully receive the corresponding CMMC level certification. Here I want to revisit that term institutionalization. The goal of CMMC is not to have Googled a bunch of policy and plan templates, but rather the goal is to demonstrate that you have truly implemented the necessary practices and policies, and they are ingrained in your organization's culture. So some interesting things that we hear from prospects and clients alike is they want to essentially for us to be able to give them a date of when they're going to be CMMC compliant. And some of them are hoping to be compliant as within 30 days. And realistically, that's not possible because not only do you need to have, if you're going for level 3, the necessary documentation, which is no small feat, you need to be able to show the evidence. And it has to be 2 types of objective evidence that I laid out before. And in order to show that evidence and have it and be able to show it to the assessor, you obviously need to have had these practices in place for a significant period of time that they'll able to come in and objectively discern that you've been saying and doing all the things that you've been saying and documenting in your policies. So another key thing about the assessments is for the most part, assessments are going to be all or nothing. Meaning if you have one practice, whether it's out of the 17 for level 1 or the 130 for level 3, you will be non-compliant and you will not have your CMMC certification. Now, one of the things that remains a bit unclear, as is a good bit of CMMC, is that it is possible that minor misses may be remediated after the assessment. But this is up to the assessor. And again, we'll cover this in our risk slide coming up. Lastly, certifications are expected to be valid for 3 years. It is possible, let's say you initially go for level 1 and hopefully achieve it. And let's say you decide that your organization is going to be involved with contracts that involve CUI. You may want to recertify sooner if you're looking to upgrade your level. Next slide, please. So this is just a recap of some key facts and definition. So the CMMC model, that is the model that the DoD put out in terms of the different practices and processes that you need to have in place. The CMMC Accreditation Board, this is a key organization. This is an organization that is run by industry for industry. The board of directors consists of folks that work in the industry. And this organization is responsible for running the program, putting out training, and evaluating and accrediting individual assessors and C3PAOs. So, and then we talked again about the C3PAOs. These are the organizations that you will actually request an assessment from. And this process is very much in development, but we have a link to the CMMC marketplace, and you will be able to look up organizations that are C3PAOs. And we'll touch a little bit more on that during the timeline. Last 2 CMMC assessments, that's what you will actually request from the C3PAO. That is essentially your audit, you will, of your practices and processes. And lastly, what you hope to obtain is the CMMC certification for whatever level you're striving for. Next slide, please. Okay, now we're going to just get a little bit into the timeline. Next slide, please. So key things to know. The CMMC standard was only actually released in January 2020. As you can imagine, COVID pushed things to the right, but it is expected that the first solicitations with CMMC requirements will be coming out this year. A few weeks ago, there was a list of the initial 7. We were on a webinar on Friday with Ms. Katie Arrington. She's the DoD official in charge of CMMC. She said that number is up to 9. And as Harry talked about, it is expected that come 2026, all DoD solicitations will have a CMMC requirement. And then just going back to what I was talking about with the C3 PAOs, only this fall have the past fall were the initial C3 PAOs granted their accreditation. So I would say over the next year, there's only a few C3 PAOs out on the marketplace right now, but I would expect in the next year, you will hopefully see significantly more so that come time when you're ready to request an assessment, you have options as to who you would like to do your assessment. Next slide, please. So the DoD released this graphic in spring 2020. The idea here, this is the depiction of what Harry talked about with the crawl, walk, run. So in 2021, they said that no more than 15 contracts would have the CMMC requirement in it. Now, that being said, it's only 15 contracts, but as you can see, their graphic shows that they expect this would impact up to 1,500 vendors. And as you can see, each year it's progressively building. But one thing to note is level 1 and level 3 are where they anticipate most vendors will need to be. So, and to sum this all up, it is expected that the CMMC will impact the estimated 300 plus DoD contracts that make up the defense industrial base. And I know there was a question submitted earlier and was answered in the chat, but to at least the latest and greatest, we anticipate if you are a non-US based supplier, you will need to comply with CMMC. There has been no distinction if you're non-US based. If you are considered part of the defense industrial base, you will need to comply with CMMC. Next slide, please. So this is where things are starting to get a little bit more gray, and we'll cover more in our slides, but CMMC and contracts, how is this actually going to function? It is possible that depending on the complexity and number of CLINs in a specific contract, a prime and subcontractors might not all need to be on the same level. And most likely this is going to be dependent on who is possessing the data, as Harry talked about. If you have CUI that you're in possession putting on your systems, it is likely that you will need to be at least level 3. If perhaps a subcontractor is entering some sort of enclave, then it's possible that, but it's not a system that they own, it's possible that they may be able to remain level 1. That's going to be very contractor specific, and realistically, at this point, no one is entirely sure how this is going to function in terms of contracts. But it is anticipated that it will apply to prime contractors and all subcontractors, meaning that even if you're a subcontractor, it is likely you're going to at least require level 1. Next, the one that people love to talk about, costs. How much is this all going to cost? And sadly, that is still a very TBD conversation, but the DoD did come out and say CMMC certification costs will be allowable costs. Next slide, please. So to cover the risks, and we're going to also touch back on a few topics, including costs. So first, risk time frame. Obviously, they're rolling this out over 5 years. COVID has already pushed it to the right a little bit. And realistically, no one knows how this is going to really play out in terms of how quickly are these contracts going to have CMMC requirements. We know there's the initial 9, but we don't know how many is going to be next year and the year after that. The best thing we can do, and we're going to talk about this more, is just start working as soon as possible. Next, the C3 PAOs, they're only being selected and trained now. So in terms of the timing of the assessments, there's a lot unclear with that. the DoD has come out and said that they're obviously going to encourage C3PAOs to focus on the vendors that are obviously impacted by the 9 pilot programs that are coming out first, which makes sense. And you would think as additional solicitations come out that impact vendors, you would like to think that vendors that are impacted by those solicitations would have some sort of priority. But realistically, that's not written in black and white anymore. Next, how will the government determine CMMC levels? So there's what the DoD has in terms of what CUI is, but a big unknown in this piece is that the DoD acquisition workforce, which is obviously significant, they're going to need to be trained on what CUI is and what CMMC is to make sure that these standard is applied correctly in contracts. And that's obviously going to be a significant effort to train the DoD acquisition workforce. Next, will the government be able to exclude businesses by CMMC level? Could they potentially deem that certain data is CUI, and will that result in much less vendors being able to bid on the contract? Really, we don't know. It's going to be interesting to see how CMMC is actually applied at the contract level. Next, how will the standard be practically assessed? To date, at least to our knowledge, no one has actually gone through an assessment. And in early December, the DoD finally released the assessment methodology, which is essentially what the C3PAOs are going to be reviewing when they come on site to conduct these assessments. And we now have a standard, which is a huge step in the right direction, just in terms of when we're working with our clients to help them better understand what the assessors are going to be looking for. But in terms of how an assessment is actually going to go, and that unknown I talked about earlier about what is, they've left a little window of there could be minor remediations that are allowed to be fixed in some sort of 90-day period following an assessment, but no one really knows what will be considered minor enough that a company will have the opportunity to remediate that and still pass their certification. And then lastly, of course, what is the true cost of certification and maintenance? I've seen this question asked on almost every webinar I've been on, which has been quite a number in the last few months. And that's really just going to be depend. And I know that's not the answer people want to hear, but it's going to depend on, do you need to go for level 1 or level 3? Level 3, as we talked about, is obviously significantly more involved than level 1. And then it also is going to depend on what is the size of your organization and what is the type of data that you're maintaining on your systems. One thing that Ms. Katie Arrington brought up on a webinar we were on Friday that I thought was really interesting is she's hoping that CMMC serves as a sort of equalizer for companies that have had strong cybersecurity posture. And what I mean by that is companies to date, let's say you were self-assessing, but you were truly trying to or successfully implemented those 110 controls with NIST 800-171. There was probably a significant cost that went into making that happen. Whereas, unfortunately, there's many companies out there that were self-assessing that they were compliant that probably didn't do a lot differently. And then come bid time, they didn't have those same costs that other companies may have invested in terms of whether it's in-house cybersecurity resources or some sort of cybersecurity tools. So she's hoping that there's somewhat of a normalization in terms of that all companies, because of this CMMC process, are going to need to reflect those costs in their rates. So when come bid time, that there won't be some sort of unfair advantage. If you are a company that is now CMMC certified, you've now realized those costs in your rates. So I thought that was a key thing to highlight that Ms. Arrington had brought up the other day. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Harry.
Thanks, James. Next slide. So James walked us through not only the model itself and the intricacies of it, and hopefully you have a better understanding of the differences between the levels, what's required in the levels, They also talked to us about how the government is approaching this and some of the risks and challenges associated with it. And those risks and challenges are very real. So now let's talk about getting to compliance. How do you get there from where you are today? And obviously that path will vary based on where you are today and the type of work that you'll be doing in the future, but it also depends on how you do work in the future. Next slide. So what CMMC maturity level should you seek? This is probably the number one question, other than cost, that we get from our customers or that we hear in various forums talking about CMMC and CMMC certification. Now, the bottom line is that not everyone needs to be level 3. Right? The government fully expects that a significant number of contractors and suppliers in the DoD supply chain will only require level 1. And level 1 is obviously much easier, much less taxing to achieve. We're only talking about 17 basic practices aimed at establishing basic cyber hygiene. And realistically, if you work at it diligently, you're looking at about 30 to 60 days to put the protections in place that will get you to level 1. Level 3, as James mentioned, an entirely different story. Here, not only do you have 130 practices versus 17, you also have the 3 processes that James mentioned. And basically, those processes include developing a written policy for each of the 17 capability domains, and then a written plan for each of the 17 capability domains. And those plans have to demonstrate that you have been and that you are appropriately resourcing each of those 17 areas, that you've been doing it over a period of time, that you're assigning personnel to work those tasks within your organization, and that it's truly become part of your standard practice and culture to do all of these things and focusing on all of these policies. And as James mentioned, it's all or nothing. So a significant difference between level 1 and level 3. So realizing that and recognizing that, if you're a supplier, are there ways that you can become certified at level 1 and still continue to do business and be compliant with the way you do your business? And there's some alternatives that we listed here. And again, it all goes back to the data and how you handle it. One alternative is handling any CUI in your organization within a specified and distinct CUI or level 3 compliant enclave or domain. So rather than have CUI in various parts of your systems and emailed from person to person within your organization, and therefore having a requirement for your entire system to be level 3 compliant, maybe you change your processes so that only a part of your network or a part of your computing enclave is ever exposed to or ever contains controlled unclassified information. And there are multiple ways to do this. You could have a CUI compliant server. I've talked to very small businesses who obtain and pass and process technical drawings and technical data on a single computer within their company or organization, and that single computer becomes that level 3 compliant domain. You can also look toward level 3 compliant cloud computing services. Obviously, there's a cost associated with it. You would have to subscribe to such a cloud service, but that is another alternative to your entire organization and entire network working towards CMMC level 3 compliance. There's also the alternative of a level 3 certified or compliant prime or subcontract. The government has actually, in the CMMC accreditation body, in their trainings, have shown examples where a prime contractor is certified at level 1, but there is a subcontractor on that team who is certified at level 3. So what happens? Any CUI is handled only by and only within the confines of that level 3 compliant subcontractor's computing environment. So anyone who's working on the contract that needs to access CUI, they look and go through that level 3 certified system, and only through that level 3 certified system. So that's another way. There are also a variety of business process changes that are likely to be unique to the given organization's current business practices that could come into play and cause you to only require level 1 as opposed to level 3. A good example, and this is a customer that we talked to recently, they are a wholesaler of equipment. So essentially, they sell parts. They don't manufacture anything, but as part of their process, they have to access and include a technical drawing with that part for inspection purposes. So obviously, they have access to that drawing. They have it on their systems, and they have to include it either in hard copy or soft copy to whoever's doing the inspection, so that that part can be inspected against the drawings and specs. So there are probably other ways to handle that, so that the information resides only on a level 3 compliant system, whether that's owned by that wholesaler subcontractor or someone else, so that the inspector logs into it, accesses the information through that system, performs their inspection, and is still compliant. And then that CUI never makes it into that supplier or that wholesaler's system or computing domain. So that's just one example of a business process change that could be explored or implemented to keep you compliant, but at level 1 versus needing to go through the additional cost and effort to become level 3 compliant. Next slide. So this slide shows you sort of the simplistic, but all the important steps on the path to CMMC certification. Many of our customers are at the learning and understanding phase right now, understanding the requirements, understanding the model, sitting through forums such as this to learn more about what they need to do and what the alternatives are. Then it's time to get to work by performing a data and a gap assessment. Identify what data needs to be protected, where it is and how it's stored, and who has access to it today. And back in the discussion of data very early in this presentation, I mentioned a homework assignment. Well, this is it. If there's one thing that you can do to help prepare for CMMC certification, it's understand what data you have in your possession today, where it is on your systems, how it's stored, and who has access to it. By getting a handle on that, you can then explore those process changes You can understand how the different controls within NIST and the different practices within CMMC will apply to you and where, and you'll be much better prepared to make a decision about level 1 versus level 3, how to implement, and whether or not you need to seek additional help. So very important. Identify the data, where it is, and how it's stored today. And then identify and document any gaps that you may have between your current cybersecurity state and your desired CMMC level. Then it's time to make a plan and remediate. Complete your system security plan, fill any gaps in your cybersecurity posture following that plan that you created, and develop those policies and plans and begin to implement them. Once you've done all that and you're confident that you've filled all the gaps, then it's time to request an assessment from a C3PAO and become certified. Then you'll be able to bid on contracts, but you're not done. Cybersecurity and the cybersecurity threats, unfortunately, are continuously evolving. And there will be changes to the model and to the protection requirements as we go. I have no doubt on that. And continuous improvement and monitoring will be required. Cybersecurity will need to be integrated into our practices and operations and our culture forever going forward. And we'll need to monitor and respond to those changing cybersecurity requirements. Next slide. So this slide just depicts some various CMMC preparation alternatives. You can choose to do this on your own. If you follow that timeline and do the homework assignment, you'll have an idea of what needs to be done, and you'll be able to make the decision as to whether or not you can or should do this on your own. Now, it will require interpretation of government speak and interpretation of technical requirements that you may need a dedicated staff with cybersecurity background and skill set to understand and to develop the policies and the procedural changes that will be needed. If you decide not to do this on your own, consulting assistance is available, and it may be helpful to gain an understanding of the requirement, the gaps, and what is needed to help fill the skill set gaps that you may have within your organization. As I said before, many government contractors, most government contractors, are probably not cybersecurity experts and probably don't have that expertise within their organization. If you don't acquire it, you can hire it out through sound consulting assistance. But one of the warnings that I would give here is beware of guarantees. We've talked to a lot of customers who have talked to various consultants who have proposed a single price to become CMMC compliant and guaranteeing them compliance within a certain period of time, a month, 6 months, a year, depending on level. That may or may not be realistic. And guarantees are fraught with peril, because so much of this depends on changing the practices, the processes, and the culture within the organization. For a consultant to guarantee you compliance is sort of risky business. Next, tools and software. There are many good tools out there available to help you manage the process, to help you manage the steps in becoming compliant and keep track of that. But tools and software alone won't get you to compliance, but they can be very helpful in helping you manage the process. For most people and most organizations, a combination is probably most appropriate that suits your tolerance for cost, schedule, and risk. So do some of it on your own, hire some of it out, purchase the right tools or hire the right consultant with the right tools, and you can come up with a solution that is the best fit for you. Next slide. So getting started, what can you do? First of all, start now. Even though we showed that the rollout timeline goes to 2026, don't count on your contract being affected by this in the year 2026. It's starting now. 9 programs have already been identified. That number will grow significantly over the next couple of years. And if you are seeking CMMC level 3 compliance or above, you're probably looking at a 9, 12 to 18-month process to get all those practices in place and to be able to demonstrate true maturity. And again, I can't understate that first M in CMMC stands for maturity. When the assessors come out, look at your practices, look at your processes, they're going to be looking for evidence that you've been doing those things over a period of time and doing them well. You can't do that overnight. You have to start now and start developing and applying and maturing those practices immediately. Determine your CMMC level requirement. Again, look at your practices, look at your processes, understand where you have CUI now and how it can be addressed, and make a decision on what CMMC level you were going to seek as an organization. Next, again, the homework assignment, identify and organize your FCI and your CUI, and consider how you will proceed and what it may cost. Next slide. So this slide just talks a little bit about what an organization like Sawdey provides. These are some of the things that we do. Just as important here is some of the things that we don't do. We are not an IT service company. A lot of the controls and practices are IT related. They require software changes, implementations, adjustment of settings to your system, hardware and server settings, etc. We don't do that. We can advise you on those things, but we are not an IT company. So what we can do is help you identify your needed CMMC level based on the type of work you're doing, the CUI that you may be handling, and clues in your existing contracts in the form of existing contract clauses. One of the things that we're offering is a pre-assessment gap analysis, which is a comprehensive pre-assessment of your organization's current cybersecurity posture. And then we identify any deficiencies with the current NIST standards and the CMMC model, and we can help you put in place a system security plan and a plan of action and milestones to then attack and address those gaps. We can help you with risk mitigation strategies, which are strategies to eliminate and reduce cybersecurity risks in general. And we can also perform a quality analysis to evaluate your progress as you go down your cybersecurity path to becoming certified. We offer assistance with the process for complying with the Interim Rule that just went into effect. So there is a scoring system. It's not difficult, but it can be a bit complex because it's not just a straight add up the 110 controls in NIST 800-171. And it can be a little bit tricky in identifying whether or not you're compliant with those controls. We can assist with that and with getting a score to enter in SPRS. And obviously we can provide education in the form of webinars or one-on-one sessions to help you understand the DoD cybersecurity standards and the policies, not only now, but as they evolve in the future. Next slide. These are some of the resources and links that we've found helpful. The first is the OSD CMMC website. Second is the CMMC accreditation body. James had mentioned the CMMC marketplace, which is listed there on the CMMC accreditation body website. There are a variety of DoD cybersecurity fact sheets and presentations at that third link. And then the DoD Office of Small Business Programs has a cybersecurity section of their website, which is pretty valuable as well. Next, we listed the SPURS link again in that 5th bullet. And then finally, the CMMC fact sheet. We will send this out to all participants, but it's essentially a single PDF that contains all of these links and more, as well as provides a lot of the definitions that we covered today and a side-by-side comparison of the NIST standard and CMMC. I'll close with this thought that, now immediately we're confronted with this NIST interim rule, and down the road we're going to be confronted with CMMC. And it's important to understand and realize that these two things and these two requirements are very similar, but they're not the same. They're complementary, but they're not identical. The immediate requirement is compliance with the interim rule and getting your scores entered in SPURS. The ultimate goal is CMMC compliance. And hopefully we've impressed upon you the standard for compliance with CMMC, the maturity that's required to be demonstrated, and what it'll take to get there. So thanks again for your time. We really appreciate it. And now I think we have just about a half hour for Q&A. And it looks like there are several that have come through on the Q&A feature of Zoom here. So.
Yeah, Harry, I'm going to go ahead and I have about 5 minutes or 2 minutes, I guess. I think of one other thing to mention before we start into the Q&A.
Yeah.
And this is a cyber workforce needs, like a focus group for cyber workforce needs. We want to be talking to you all about a little bit. Basically, what this means is that the Department of Defense really wants your feedback on what it takes to develop your workforce to get all of these requirements. If you go to the next slide, they're looking at a lot of different things. They're looking at, do you work on this internally? Do you work on it externally? Do you work on it with some sort of a combination? Do you need new skill sets? Can you get by with the existing skill sets, but to do that with training or better disciplines or new processes? This would be the type of feedback that they would be looking for. So if you go to the next slide, really what we would like to see, if it would be possible, is if you are interested in giving this feedback, I will set up a separate session to go over, these real topics, like what are your workforce needs, what's driving them, what are the possible solutions, and how the new DFARS requirements has impacted your workforce. Those are the different types of things that we can spend some time talking about. We're gonna have a poll right now with just a yes or no question on it. If you are interested in participating in this, just say yes. And I will contact you separately for a different discussion and maybe some further survey questions so that we can make sure we give this feedback to the Department of Defense so everybody knows the workforce needs that are out there. Looks like everybody's already filling that in, so that's great. We'll wait for that to go. And for those of you saying yes, you will hear from me probably before the end of the week to set something else up for that discussion. Let's give it just a few more seconds. I think we're slowing down here. Okay, looks like we have everybody's in. So we'll go ahead and end the polling for now. And looks like a number of you have said you're very interested, so that's great. We'll contact you from there. With that, let's jump right into the Q&A. We have about 30 minutes left or so to go through the questions. We have a lot of questions. We covered a lot of ground today, so happy to do some clarifications or answer your questions specifically going forward.
So this is Mike Smith. Harry, if you could go over three, I would say, main rocks or big rocks. Part of this is one is how foreign suppliers are supposed to be compliant. Number two would be the OSU grant, a possible grant for that. And then also number three would be for a supplier, how would they actually know? I know that you talked about, it would be known in the CLIN, in the contract itself, but could you go over that again and restate that? Those are, some of the big rocks, and I'm still answering questions too.
Okay. So thanks, Mike. The first one was foreign suppliers, non-US based suppliers. And
yes, and the SPS score, correct.
Yeah, James touched on that and just said that, we haven't seen a distinction made between foreign and domestic suppliers. So the assumption would be that the same standards would apply. But again, it's all related to the data itself. So if the foreign-based supplier handles and possesses CUI, then they'll be required to have a CMMC level 3 or above. If they only possess and work with federal contract information, or FCI, then they can get by potentially with CMMC level 1. If they don't possess either somehow, then say they're only a subcontractor and no CUI gets to them, then there's a chance that they will not need to be CMMC certified. But if they're a subcontractor, we already know through the existing DFARS clauses and the ones that are coming that they will. So again, no distinction has been made between foreign and domestic suppliers. So I don't think we'll see any different rule set, if that makes sense.
If that does.
Thanks. So Mike, you mentioned the DCAP grant. So did
yes.
Someone specifically ask about that?
So there are multiple questions about that. Yes. Okay. And it was just, are there available grants to help assist with the CMMC?
Okay. I can answer that. And the DCAP did provide for some relief for some of these pre-assessments that Harry mentioned. Unfortunately, it was a limited number, and that amount of that part of the grant has been used up at this time.
Thank you. And is there any indication for further, or how would they find out further about that?
So there is a possibility that it could be reapproved. We don't have any feedback yet as to whether or not that will happen going into the new year. But if it is, we will make sure that all of the participants on this call hear about it.
Great, thank you. And then Harry, to be more specific, what I would say is the contract will tell you what CMMC level you're required. But now let's say, for example, a company has, or a supplier has, a CMMC level 3. Does that mean that all subcontractors require a CMMC level 3? Could you go over that?
No, not at all. If the contract requires level 3 and the prime contractor is level 3 compliant, so long as CM or CUI is handled by and only by the prime contractor or any team members or subcontractors that are also CMMC level 3 compliant, then you're good. So, I mentioned the example where one member of the team could be the prime or a sub is level 3. It's a level 3 contract. And as long as CUI information is only stored, accessed, and processed within that level 3 compliant domain, then that satisfies or should satisfy the requirement. Now, since we haven't actually seen this rolled out in specific contracts yet, and since we haven't seen any actual audits or assessments performed yet, we're not sure how that arrangement or levels of compliance or certification will need to be communicated or approved by the government. But I suspect that there will need to be some proposal, if you will, back to the government on how that's going to work. Whether it's a simple information flow diagram or a boundary diagram for information, so that the government is confident that it's handled, that there's a level 3 and above compliant team member, and that only that team member on their system will handle that information. But assuming that, you know, and I expect that we'll see that once we start seeing evaluations done and once we start seeing contracts with the requirements actually in them. No, to answer the question, no, not everyone on that team or on that contract needs to be the highest level specified in the contract.
Great, thank you. And so here's another big rock or big question is many of the questions asked were, you know, what is the CUI? You know, the CUI registry, what I've been explaining, I've been sending the links out to the CUI registry. Let's say, you know, for example, here in, you know, Drew Kidder, he asks, you know, when do the design documents we create become CUI? And, you know, it's just, you know, trying to handle or understand what is CUI.
Yeah, I see Drew's question here. That's a good question. When do the design documents that we create become CUI, and can we abstract CUI information in a way that makes it not CUI? Not sure about that. As I mentioned, just this past spring, the DoD published a, I'm looking for the slide where we had that mentioned. Hold on one second. Yeah, so on slide 11, we mentioned, oh, I'm sorry, no, I think it's 21. We mentioned that the DoD released DoD instruction 5000 or 5200.48 back in March. And it establishes the DoD policy and assigns the responsibilities for CUI. And it prescribes the procedures for identifying and marking CUI. So, Drew, I think your question of when does it become CUI can be answered there. So I would look up and research DODI 5200.48 for more information. In addition, the DoD at that same time came up with a marking scheme so the contractors will know when they receive CUI, but also how marking needs to be done for CUI that may be created. So again, that instruction has a lot more information on it on marking and handling CUI specifically.
Absolutely, because it's a process. And, you know, right. We had went and we participated, you know, with a business. And what we kind of told them is, you know, some people have to abide by those standards, which are DoD contractors. You know, some don't, like the vendors that, you know, you could be going to a site looking at, you know, schematics. That vendor may not be required. But if you are a vendor, a DoD supplier, you're mandated to be able to identify if this is a CUI for you, you should consider it as CUI. And I'm still going on. If you want to go to the next question, you know, that'd be great, you know, from Amit.
Okay. Yeah, here's a question. We are a prospective service provider to help General Dynamics procure indirect materials, COTS products, and personal safety, janitorial supplies, office supplies, hand tools, etc. So do we require a CMMC certification? If required, I'm assuming it would be level 1. Yeah, so again, it depends on the type of data. So if it's required, it will most likely be level 1, but the government has said that CMMC will not apply to COTS products. But again, then you get into the definition of, what is COTS, and, a lot of times the government will buy things and it'll be a minor modification from a COTS product. So you get into a gray area there as to whether or not it'll apply. But for some of the things that you mentioned there, probably not. The next question that I see here is, how does the CMMC model relate or compare to ISO 27001? And if there is a list of level 3 compliant cloud providers. So the first one is ISO 27001. Mike, do you have a feel for how CMMC relates to 27001, and could you?
Yep. So the CMMC level 1, for the, let's just say for the ISO 27001, about 80% of the security controls within the ISO 27001 are within the CMMC level 3 requirement. The cloud providers, our recommendation, it would be great to find a cloud provider, AWS, Google, Azure. A lot of these third-party cloud providers have sites already set up. Now, what will happen is you as a supplier will have to go onto the site and you'll have to develop your processes, your IT processes around those cloud providers. But the cloud providers, they do say, hey, this site is set up for CMMC level 3 or ISO 27001. Yes, they can do that. It's just a process for the suppliers.
Okay. Thank you, Mike. So getting back to the 27001 question, yeah, there's a significant amount of overlap between these standards. CMMC is very closely related to the NIST standard. As Mike mentioned, a lot of 27001 is contained in there as well. The biggest difference, I would say, is the certification requirement and the requirement to demonstrate and have specific policies, practices, and plans in place that demonstrate maturity in order to achieve certification. So similar to ISO, right? ISO requires a certification as well, and you have to demonstrate a number of things in order to achieve that certification. So CMMC works in very much the same way. The next question is an interesting one. I'm a passport and visa company. What level will my company be required? And the data is passport information received via email and then submitted to third-party software. That's a great question, and I don't have a good answer for that. So, if you look at all the different categories of CUI information, PII-like or type of information, such as what you're probably collecting and passing for passports, is included in there. If it's being done and is part of a government contract, then it's probably considered CUI and will need to be protected at yep. level 3 or above. Yep. But again, there may be a way to look at and modify your process so that within your computing domain and your IT system, you never take possession of that data, and you don't store that data. If that's the case, or if you can access it in another way on a system that is or will be level 3 compliant, then your company may not need to be level 3, if that makes sense. What else do we have, Mike?
Great. If you could keep on going, I'm as you're answering. Also, I'm answering questions, so you're doing great. Thank you.
The next one: what are the tools and software available? There's many of them out there. One of the pieces of software that we use is Aptega. I'm in no way promoting that software. We like it as a tool for managing the compliance process for ourselves and for our customers. There are many others like it available. There are also different vulnerability scanning softwares, software packages, available that can help detect vulnerabilities. There's just a lot of them that are out there. If you work with a consultant, or if you start with a Google search on cybersecurity software, you'll come up with quite a few.
Yeah, and Sharon, just to add to that, we were on a webinar the other day where the CMMC Accreditation Board chair was on it. And ultimately, they are hoping to be able to list tools and software on the CMMC marketplace. But that is unfortunately, I guess, a step down a road for them. Right now, their focus is really getting those C3 PAOs accredited so they can start doing the actual assessments. But that is ultimately a goal of theirs.
Thanks, James. So next question regarding our services around pre-assessment and gap analysis. Does the pre-assessment mean registered provider organization grade assessment prior to final C3 PAO step? The answer is yes. So we are actually registering as a C3 PAO organization, and we do have several CMMC accreditation body credentialed individuals within our organization. James and myself are both registered practitioners. Mike is on his way to becoming a certified professional and ultimately a certified assessor. I say on his way because all the training is not complete and available for that yet, but yes, we are a credentialed organization with credentialed practitioners to provide those services. The next question regarding the DFARS clauses 7008, 9, and 12, it looks like full compliance is already required. And yes, that's true. But from other clauses, it looks like this is a process of a few years. Please clarify. Okay, so the new DFARS clauses 70, 19, 20, and 21 are in the process of being rolled out. So 7019 and 7020 went into effect. Actually, all three of them went into effect on December 1st. But they become a requirement when it's contract time, essentially. So 7019 and 7020 are for new contracts or new options going forward. They're not necessarily retroactive to existing contracts. And 7021 comes into play when that contract has a CMMC requirement finally put in it. So I hope that answers the question about the timeline and the distinction between the older clauses and the new. The next question, do special processors, platers, heat treaters, et cetera, require level 1 or level 3 now and in the future? And Ron, unfortunately, the only way I can answer that is to understand the data that you possess or access. If you are in possession of data that's defined as CUI in your systems, then level 3 or above will be required in the future. If you do not, or if you're able to, structure your process in such a way that you do not need to be in possession on your systems of level of CUI data, then you can probably get by with level 1 at a minimum.
Harry, just to watching the clock here, we're at about 5 minutes till the end of the presentation. We'll stay on for about 10 extra minutes answering questions. And what we don't get to, we'll follow up in writing. So even if you have to leave now, it will be part of the recording for another 15 minutes or so here. And then we will, whatever we don't get to, we'll try to respond to in writing. Okay?
Thanks, Charlie. So the next question is from Christopher, and Christopher, this is an awesome question. While it has been stated CUI will be properly marked moving forward, how is legacy materials, engineering drawings, et cetera, from the last year to 12 years and further back than that, I would even guess, that lack labeling or has FOUO and still being manufactured, repaired to be identified and handled? So that's a concern. And that's probably one that we should add to our risk slide, is how is legacy data and drawings and data sets, et cetera, going to be handled for when those contracts renew or when an option is exercised. Right now, CMMC, much like the new defarce clauses, we're being told will apply to new contracts going forward. So they'll be applied to contracts over time, and then all contracts around 2026 and beyond. What I have heard is that the program managers or the program office or the requiring activity for that item will need to identify CUI at the time of contract award. So when it comes time for that contract to renew, what's supposed to happen is, the acquisition workforce or the contracting officer should work with the program manager to get a listing, a definitive inventory, to establish an understanding of what consists or is considered CUI. And that should be clearly communicated to the contractor at time of award. Now, I don't expect that to be a perfect process. And, I recognize that, we have contracts that are 20, 30, 40 years old that, items from those original contracts are still being manufactured. So how that backlog of legacy data will be handled sort of remains to be seen. And I haven't heard a good answer to that question yet. So all I can tell you is how it's supposed to work. The next question, only my subcontractors that I share CUI with will need to be CMMC compliant, ? That's correct. But it also depends how you share it. So if you're sending it to them and they'll take possession of it on their systems, then that indicates level 3 or above. If you share it by them accessing your system or some other level 3 compliant system, then they may not need to be CMMC level 3 compliant. The next part of the question, if I do not share any TDP or prints, they will not be required. Yeah, if you don't share technical data with them, if you don't actually send it to them, then they should not need level 3 unless they're accessing it as part of another contract or or with another prime. Next question from Sharon. If GDLS is the prime and therefore required to be CMMC, why do their suppliers need to deal with this? Well, and Sharon, the answer again goes back to the data. If because of the way the process is structured or has to be structured, that CUI data needs to be shared or passed from a prime to a sub or a supplier, then anyone who touches that data, regardless of whether they're a prime or a sub, needs to have that same level of certification, 3 or above. If they don't share data and we're only talking about federal contract information, then we're looking at level 1 at least. Okay, next question. Will CMMC be applicable if item is determined to be EAR 99? And I apologize, Tracy, I don't know what EAR 99 means.
Hey,
Maybe-
Harry, I can jump in here.
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
do believe, I just did a quick search. I do believe EAR 99 is considered a type of CUI. So,
Okay.
Again, I guess to just recap, CMMC is pretty much applicable to all of the defense industrial base, and unless you're only focused on COTS products. So it's not as much as does CMMC apply as what levels of CMMC is applicable to your organization, which
Great way
is,
to put it.
yeah. Harry, I can try to take a couple of these to give you a
Yeah.
little break.
Go ahead. We'll take a breath.
All right. So we talked about EAR 99. Ron, we are a small company under 10 employees with one connected computer connected to the internet. The rest are isolated on an internal network. Would this be considered a good start? Mike, I'll ask you to jump in, but I would say that's, again, it's a good start. It's better than having lots of computers unnecessarily connected to outside systems. But ultimately, it's going to depend on what kind of data you have on the system and what you're doing to protect that data.
Right. And what I'd also answer to that too is it depends on what CMMC level that you're trying to accomplish. Because there's a big difference. I mean, even a small supplier, let's just say, may be required to have a CMMC level 3. So at a CMMC level 3, you need a computing environment, a centralized managed computing environment. Great response.
Thanks, Mike. Next, Luke, I know you have a question mentioning you guys sell COTS products, and you're wondering who's best to have a conversation with. In this situation, if you don't have any contracts directly with the DoD, if that was the case, we would definitely recommend that you talked with the contracting officers of the the specific contract. But if GDLS is the intermediary between you and the DoD, it's probably best to have that conversation with them to clarify that you only are providing COTS products and that you're not receiving FCI or CUI.
Great response.
Ron, we are currently going through an AS9100D. Can we add the CMMC to this? Mike, are you familiar with that?
I'm looking it up right now. So can you go to the next one and I'll have a response in a second?
Sure. Ron, my guess off the cuff, and Mike will follow up with us, but we've been living and breathing CMMC, and I haven't seen anything about AS9100. So I'm going to say that it's probably a separate requirement that you're going through.
Yeah, so just looking at it, it's similar to the ISO 9001. So yes, so if you have the AS9100D, that will help you in your becoming CMMC compliant.
Thanks, Mike.
because many of the controls are within that. Now, depending on, CMMC level 3, you'll have less. CMMC level 1, you'll be in great shape.
Thanks, Mike. Next question, Scott. This is a great question about, is FedRAMP ready authorized status a requirement for CMMC level 3 certified cloud providers? Something along this lines came up on one of the webinars we were on recently. And unfortunately, they haven't put out any, I guess, requirements of the CMMC level 3 in terms of software and cloud providers. But Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, I would think that it's going to be.
Yes, so the FedRAMP, FedRAMP are usually associated with the NIST 800-53, which is significantly higher than the CMMC level. So if you don't need to have FedRAMP to be CMMC level 3. FedRAMP goes way beyond that. Now, there's sites that say that they're NIST 800-171 compliant. I would go back to them and say, can you be NIST 800 or CMMC level requirement? But yes, a good cloud provider that is FedRAMP, they'll be able to answer those questions.
Thanks, Mike. Another good question. If I want to stick to level 1, what should I do with old drawings received over the years? I believe at the CUI registry site, I think there are instructions about what to do in terms of proper wiping of data for systems that used to have CUI on it. Mike, do you have anything to add on this?
Yes, I see the question in as a two-part. One is part one, what you're talking about is would be the question, how do I get rid of them? Which would be, yes, wiping drives clean. What my recommendation for, let's say you have current drawings and old drawings, I'd start with your current drawings and making sure that those are CMMC identified or CUI identified. And what I would do is I'd start current and I'd go back as you have time over the years to identify and properly categorize the drawings. I would start current, because just understanding your current status is a hurdle. And, to go over many and many documents, okay, it's going to take you time. So one at a time.
Thanks, Mike. Looks like another participant was having issues with SPRS. We've been trying to upload their readiness plan. I'm not sure if this is in reference to the interim rule, just because to my knowledge, I believe you have to write the name of your system security plan. And I don't know if this by readiness plan, if you're talking about a POAM, right? You don't actually have to upload the POAM. You just have to put a get well date.
Yes.
So Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't actually think as part of the interim rule, you're uploading a readiness plan.
No, correct. You're just implementing your date that you are to be completed.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we don't have any alternative options to, SPRS support. I would just suggest, the links that they provide on, the screenshot we showed earlier, unfortunately. So next, are we as a supplier required to verify our suppliers are compliant, or will GDLS do this? Or will there be a database available to see who is compliant as is in the aerospace sector? That's a great question. I would defer to someone from GDLS if they are still on the line, but our recommendation to clients would be, you're responsible for whoever are subcontractors to you. So I would suggest that there is an onus on you, if you have subcontractors, to ensure that your subcontractors are, compliant with whichever CMMC level is applicable, again, based on if that subcontractor will have FCI or CUI on their system. And
at a minimum, it's going to be, you're going to have to be at least a CMMC level 1 at a minimum to have a government contract.
Right.
Right. And I don't, at least what's been shared to date, there's not going to be some sort of comprehensive database available. The DoD has come out and said that there will be, I believe on SPURS, you'll be able to see if a company has a CMMC certification, but you won't be able to see what level it is. That was at least the latest and greatest we heard.
I heard the
Hey,
same.
James. This is Matt Riddle from GDLS. Just a quick answer to that question from our perspective.
Thank you, Matt.
We do have an we do have an expectation that our suppliers are flowing down the same requirements that we flowed onto them with those that they chose to work with. So to your point, the CMMC certification levels would apply, and the expectation would be that for example, our tier 1 suppliers would understand what the status of their tier 1 suppliers are, right, or our sub tiers from there, and then plan and work accordingly.
Thanks,
and also,
Matt.
sorry, no worries. If I may go back just one question, just as a refresher for those listening, we do have existing data control requirements that require suppliers to, as necessary, destroy old drawings when the current contracts are complete. So the expectation is that there would not be a large backlog of data, though I understand that that's not always true, but just, kind of as a reminder, the existing data protection clauses that do apply to hard copies also do apply to digital versions therein. So when a contract is complete, in many cases, the expectation is that those drawings are stored or destroyed as required.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you for clarifying.
So next, Nada, this is a good question because it touches on a few things. Will we be able to have some of our employees certified as C3PAOs, and would we be able to assess ourselves? Great question. So first, C3PAOs, that will actually be similar to CMC. That is a entity level certification. So different companies will be C3PAOs. Those companies will have certified assessors and certified professionals. And again, as we talked about, the training for the certified professionals and assessors isn't even really fully implemented yet, but Mike, as part of our team, will be going for it. And then at the organizational level, so in our instance, Sawdey has applied to become a C3PAO. So, and would we be able to assess ourselves? Definitely not. So the key thing, going back to our CMMC slide, was third-party assessment. And another key thing to note here is, let's say you do hire a company to come in and provide pre-assessment services. In most cases, there is some ambiguity in terms of using different teams, but in most cases, the company that you hire to provide your pre-assessment services, if you go that route, will be a different company than the C3PAO that comes in and does your assessment for conflict of interest reasons. Next, Lorenzo, as a non-US supplier with CUA data for Prime, is SPURS self-assessment required? Yes. 110 questions answered and evaluated with 60 days to implement, correct. How does this translate to CMMC level certification? So it's better to think of the 110 controls related to, the first question, the 17 practices that are related to level 1 are within the 110 that are part of the NIST 800-171. When we compare the NIST to level 3, all 110 controls of the NIST are within the 130 practices of CMMC level 3. I think that's it in terms of our open questions. Thank you again for everyone's time today, and we really appreciate all the questions. These were great questions, and sadly, unfortunately, there's still a lot to be determined with CMMC, but as Harry talked about, the most important thing is to assess where you are now. That's the biggest thing. Where do you stand now? What are the gaps in terms of striving for levels 1 and level 3? Harry?
Yeah, and just to
closing. Sorry, go ahead, Charlie.
I was just going to say, I wanted to thank all three of you from Sawdey Solution Services for very well prepared presentation today and answering all the questions in a very quick way. And I think we made it through a lot of them. Also very much like to thank GDLS and their team for allowing us to work with them on this. So I think it's been a good exercise. At the beginning of the presentation, we gave out some of our email addresses. So when you get your copy of the presentation, you can follow up with us if there's anything else that you need. And on behalf of everyone else in the panel here today, I just wanted to thank all of the people joining. 2 minutes ago, I looked and there were still 120 people on. So it's been a great attendance from everybody, and we thank you very much. And with that, we'll sign off. Thank you so much.
Thank you.